We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years, since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the Darkened Hour.
Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald, and with me today is co-host Richard Cox. Richard, how are you today?
Very good. Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me along.
And with us today is a very special guest with a unique view inside Guantanamo, Alka Pradhan. Alka Pradhan is an American human rights attorney who has represented Guantanamo Bay detainees, civilian drone strike victims, and other torture victims. Currently works for the U.S. Department of Defense Military Commissions Defense Organization and represents Ammar al-Baluchi in the case of the United States versus Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for the 9/11 attacks. Pradhan also works as a defense attorney at the International Criminal Court. She additionally is an active participant in the United Nations human rights mechanisms with submissions on presentations on behalf of clients to the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the United Nations Committee Against Torture, the Human Rights Committee, and the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. She has co-written or advised on several amicus curiae briefs submitted to the U.S. Supreme Court and has also been on numerous law reviews and media articles on the relationships between human rights and national security issues. It is a pleasure to have you, Alka Pradhan. Thank you very much for coming on.
And thank you so much for the invitation.
I want to start out simple. And I remember you receiving a bachelor's in international relations from the Johns Hopkins University and also your master's in international law and South Asian studies from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And could you just tell me, who are the primary influences to become involved in these fields for you?
I think it started with my grandfather. He was actually an economist and then later a diplomat from India, and he helped found the Asian Development Bank and then ended up in Geneva, where he spent 30 years at the UN. So we were very fortunate. I lived in the US, but I used to spend almost every summer in Geneva with him and kind of learning about the city, and all of their friends were these very accomplished diplomats. And, Manmohan Singh, the former Prime Minister of India, worked for my grandfather at one point. Amartya Sen, the famous economist, worked with my grandfather at one point. So we're very, very lucky to know some of those people. And I think that sort of spurred my interest in international relations and politics and law.
Okay, so fast forward, the September 11 attacks happened, and where were you?
Adam, sorry, can I pause you a second? I was just interested. In an interview of Alka, I heard you refer to the 90s being a kind of formative decade with the events there in international law, and I assumed you were talking about Yugoslavia and maybe Rwanda, but I wasn't quite sure. What events were in the 90s that influenced the direction of your career, and could you just explain what about them kind of inspired you to move in this direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so certainly the setup of the mechanisms in Yugoslavia and former Yugoslavia, of course, and Rwanda were big events to me. And that was something I was watching very closely, because then in high school, we started, I was doing debate a lot. I was involved in Model UN, and I attended summer programs focusing on international relations. And I was pretty sure at that point I wanted to be a lawyer, only because my father kept saying, you argue all the time, you need to be a lawyer. And so that was sort of what I was thinking. And when at that same time that those tribunals were being set up, there was talk of setting up a permanent international criminal court. And of course, we know that was set up finally in 2000. But I was very closely watching all of that. And my thought was that eventually I wanted to work for one of those courts, that I was thinking, oh, I'm going to go and be a prosecutor and be, and prosecute the genocidaires and, at one of these courts. So that was my thinking at the time.
After the September 11 attacks, during them, where were you, and were the attacks used as a jumpstart precursor into your life today as a litigator for Guantanamo detainees?
Yeah, I mean, so I was in Baltimore at the time. It was my third year of college. And it was, as everybody's got a story about where they were, and it was just like everyone else. It was absolutely terrifying. I had friends in New York, I had family in New York. I had friends in DC. Like no one knew if people were coming from Baltimore. There were rumors of planes going to Columbus, where my family was, because of Battelle, the research institution. Just there was rumors flying everywhere. So it was terrifying. But also what started immediately was this discussion. I mean, I think just the day after of, okay, we know it's bin Laden. Where do we think bin Laden is? Bin Laden's in Afghanistan. So you know what? Saddle up, we're going to Afghanistan. And I remember on like the very next day or the day after having this really intense conversation with friends. We were all in international relations at the time. And I was like, look, none of us agrees, personally or politically with the Taliban. But there is a difference between Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization, and Taliban, the governing entity of Afghanistan. They are not the same thing. And even back then in 2001, we knew that. So the fact that suddenly all, these things are suddenly being conflated and we're hearing, backlash against Muslims here in the United States indicated that this is the course we're going to go down for a while, right? Like we should be more sophisticated than this, but fear is driving fear, which was legitimate, right? But we're allowing it to drive some very serious decisions. And nobody knows how bad it's going to get. If we're going to invade Afghanistan, because we think bin Laden may be there, and he was for a period of time, but of course he wasn't caught there. We need to be very careful what was happening. And that is not what happened next, right? We were not, in fact, very careful about what we did next. And you'll know how that story ends. But when I teach a seminar at Penn, and when I teach this, it's always shocking to the students, no matter what their political leanings are, at the fact that we just rode into Afghanistan thinking we would have a small footprint, thinking that, we would work with the Northern Alliance and not really even knowing who those people were, thinking that we could go get in, get out, get bin Laden in, 2 weeks without having proper linguists available, right? Just basic things like that. It was I hate to say it in hindsight because it seems reductionist, but it's also true. It was a very cowboy mentality.
I have a follow-up to this because I think this is so overlooked by most people who investigate 9/11 itself. And it was such an important time because in the weeks after 9/11, Alka, the White House legal counsel, like Attenborough and John Yoo, and just incidentally, they have warrants for their arrest in Malaysia, actually. They're the only country where they have warrants for their arrest. And they basically rewritten they sidestepped the Geneva Convention for foreign enemy combatants in that they're not afforded the Geneva Convention because they're not Americans. And this actually was passed without the pre-knowledge of the Attorney General John Ashcroft or the National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. When they found out, it was a little bit too late. This would later turn out to be crucial because the CIA wanted to get additional information from these detainees, which I'm going to ask about you in a bit here. But, how was it that the State Department basically could not, some elements anyway, could not fight off against, Dick Cheney and the CIA regarding these measures regarding sidestepping the Geneva Convention for foreign enemy combatants?
They were essentially they were cut out of the picture. I mean, there was this early memo that I'm sure you've seen from Will Taft when he was consulted on John Yu's, grand plans to sidestep the Geneva Conventions, where it's quite a sharp response, and he says none of this, like this is not at all in keeping with domestic jurisprudence,
Right.
much
Yeah.
less international jurisprudence, and this is completely wrong. This is a misreading. I think there's a point at which I forget his exact wording, but he basically says this is a complete misunderstanding of the law and should not go and beyond this conversation, essentially. And the result was that they cut the State Department out of those conversations after that. And it was the White House at the top, the CIA, and then you had bits of DOD involved to be able to facilitate sort of movements and operational logistics, particularly in Afghanistan, but then, of course, as we know, at Guantanamo Bay and in eventually Iraq and elsewhere. But there was a nexus between the White House and the CIA that were just doing their own thing for a very long time.
So and right away, the first detainee captured, it's Abu Zubaydah, and he becomes the first person to experience these enhanced interrogation techniques in its very initial forms. The program is actually expanded with other detainees later on, which we'll get into, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Ben al-Shib. But the CIA contractors behind that are James Mitchell and Bruce Jess, and they're the architects of the torture program called the SEIR Program. What are your thoughts regarding the torture of Abu Zubaydah and later on these other detainees? Did you ever envision something like this happen? Because I mean, you're a lot more educated in this field than I am at the time, and basically, I would have never thought something like this could have happened. Which
No.
basically, and they had to have known, Alka,
Yeah.
that the torture just doesn't work.
So, I spent last week with Bruce Jessen. He was down at Guantanamo, and we were examining him. And so I think there are a couple of things that happened in 2001. As you mentioned, Abu Zubaydah is arrested, and they had been looking at Abu Zubaydah for a long time, and had sort of built him up as this major figure. We now know, of course, he was not. And I want to be very clear about that. The United States government has, since about 2010, taken reversed its position and has said definitively that Abu Zubaydah was not a member of Al-Qaeda and did not have anything to do with 9/11. So let me just be very clear about that, because the more people need to say that out loud.
Yes.
Poor guy's still there. But he's captured in 2001. We think he's a big deal. We think he's got all sorts of information that we want from him. And so Mitchell and Jessen had been involved with the SEIR program for a very long time. And of course, that is meant to enable, as they describe it, and as it's meant to be, enable U.S. service members to withstand not just torture, but detention in foreign hands, right? Just don't succumb, don't give away secrets. And if you do, recover from it, right? So they take these techniques that have been used on people in the SEIR program, and they say, well, we can now use these techniques to force people, to coerce people into complying. And once they comply, then they will answer questions. Now, what's interesting is that everybody, the common story about this is that Mitchell and Jessen are like the architects of the CIA rendition program. And that's sort of true. But at the same time that Mitchell and Jessen are doing this to Abu Zubaydah, there is a separate group of people at CIA trying to set up a separate, more expansive detention program that will use some of the same techniques. And so the story that we now have heard that has just come out in the past year or two is that actually, Jessen and Mitchell do this with Abu Zubaydah, they do it with Nashiri, they eventually do it with KSM and a few others. But at the same time, the CIA is setting up other sites for sort of medium level detainees and people they're collecting in Afghanistan and other places. And they're using these techniques that no one's been trained for, not even the authorizations that Mitchell and Jessen got, right? Which are authorizations for torture. Let's be clear. They're not even none of these other people in these other sites are authorized for anything. They're just using whatever comes to mind, right? That's where you get in Zero Dark 30, right? The images of people at this site, Cobalt, right? Strung up by their wrists and being put on tarps and mock drowned, none of which were approved techniques. So you see in the immediate devolution of those techniques, right? You're like, oh, this is going to be a very controlled program. Only 2 people are going to run it. And you've got 10 techniques that are going to be used in this very controlled way. And immediately, which is what happens with torture, immediately gets kind of taken and bastardized and used in all sorts of ways and all sorts of people as revenge techniques. And so did I ever imagine that the US government would be opening secret prisons in far-flung countries, contrary to those countries' laws, contrary to our laws, and holding people for years and telling them you're never going to see the light of day again. You're never going to see your family again, threatening them with drills and things like that. Like it sounds, it sounds crazy. Even now it sounds crazy. I've been working on this for 15 years. It sounds crazy.
It sounds like a horror film, actually. Just to reiterate your point, it's just something I posted from time to time, and it's from the Washington Post, and it was dated June 16, 2009, and the headline is blazingly obvious. CIA says it misjudged role of high-value detainees Abu Zubaydah. And it was before, I believe it was before his combatant status tribunal hearing, where he basically says he's being told by the CIA that we discovered you're not number 3, not a partner, not even a fighter.
Yeah.
And yet he's considered a forever detainee without charge.
Yeah. And the only reason for that is because we can't charge him because of what we did to him. And there's nothing to charge him with anyway.
Right.
We can't charge him with anything because of what we did to him. And we can't let him go because of what we did to him, because nobody wants him speaking freely about the horrors that he lived through at these sites.
And even just to add to that, Alka, by the way, in the Senate committee reports, and this is from a cable that was sent by Detention Site Green regarding Bruce Jessen and James Mitchell, and it says, quote, "Our goal was to reach the stage where we have broken any will or ability of subject to resist or deny providing us information, intelligence to which he had access. We additionally sought to bring subject to the point where we confidently assess that he does not possess undisclosed threat information or intelligence that could prevent a terrorist event," end quote. But the problem with the torture is that the guy is going to tell you everything you wanted to hear.
Right. Right.
And
listen, we went 10 rounds on this with both Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Jessen when they were on the witness stand, and they sort of, so they believe 2 things. I think they truly believe them. I think they have to. First, they believe that the way they conceived of and then implemented the techniques was very controlled, and within that control, they could measurably, they could impose a measured amount of stress for a short period of time that would induce compliance such that these people would then later provide information. And they say it was within, and you say, well, that's uncontrolled stress. That's what torture is. It breaks people. And they say, no, it wasn't uncontrolled. And this is the second thing they truly believe. It wasn't uncontrolled. The detainees maintained control because all they had to do was talk. It was up to them whether or not to talk, right? And there is no budging them from those 2, what they believe as truths. And I think they do believe that. I think they actually believe that that is what they were doing.
Well, Mitchell lends to believe, he did a documentary, I think, with Vice at the time, that he actually said he believed everything about the program itself and it saved lives.
Yes, he still says that, and Dr. Jessen says that as well, that they truly believe that. We asked them, we said, look, like, isn't it true that you did this to Abu Zubaydah thinking he had information about a nuclear attack? Did you ever get information about a nuclear attack? No. So, and they were like, well, that was the information. Like, we're not the intelligence analysts. We were told That's the information that they had. And so we believed the intelligence analysts at the time. Right. So there's this sort of weird kind of blame shifting and sort of like drawing lines in the sand where there aren't any regarding torture and what we did that don't exist in real life.
Right. And, from your experience, I always wanted to ask this question. You've dealt with both men, Jess and Mitchell. How would you gauge them as individuals?
I mean, I find them both, personally troubling, obviously.
Yes.
And look, I'm trying to be circumspect, and having now spent some time in the room with both of them, and particularly questioning Dr. Jessen, I don't have sympathy. I do believe that they believe certain things, whether that's something they need to do, to rationalize what happened or not. And I also believe, and I think the record bears this out, that the CIA has systematically thrown them under the bus for this program in a way that they are not fully responsible for. So they started this, and they continue to defend it, and they continue to be trotted out by the agency to defend it. But there are dozens and dozens of CIA personnel who have been allowed to remain anonymous for 20 years, while Mitchell and Jessen are thrown out continuously as the architects of this program, when in fact, as I mentioned, at the same time Mitchell and Jessen are doing all of these guys are over here torturing the living daylights, killing Gul Rahman, okay,
Yes.
right, and torturing the living daylights out of people whose names we may never know in these various sites. And that is what happened to Mr. al-Baluchi. It wasn't Mitchell and Jessen who tortured Mr. al-Baluchi. It was actually these other unnamed CIA personnel. So, I think Mitchell and Jessen have a lot to reckon with. And it's really unconscionable. But there's a lot of accountability to be had in the agency as well.
Well, I do want to talk about that in a minute for you regarding that. Gul Rockman, by the way, interesting you bring this name up. I believe he froze to death.
Yes, he froze to death. He was beaten just mercilessly at the site. They thought he had information. Of course, they always think they have information. Yeah. They beat him mercilessly. He was characterized as a resistor. Whether he was or not, we'll never know because he died. He was killed. And he was nude, at least from the waist down, in freezing temperatures, sub-zero temperatures in this hellhole called Cobalt that even Jessen described as medieval. And that's how they found him, just frozen, and it took them years to even acknowledge that he'd been killed there. His poor family didn't know where he was.
And by the way, his body's never been found, correct?
His body's never been found.
Wow. Now, the United States finally announces that they're pressing charges of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other four, and it was announced on February 11, 2008. Even though there have been hearings, the trial never really officially has begun. And you're currently involved in, these hearings as well. And is it because not just of the torture program, which I think is the driving measure, but also is it because of a lack of evidence regarding the complicity of these individuals?
So there are a few different things to unpack. I think it was a huge mistake. Number one was the torture. The torture is the middle, is the center, the be all and end all of this entire thing, right? The reason we had to establish a new quote unquote legal forum at Guantanamo Bay is because we could not have these people in federal court after we had tortured them for several years, right? So that's why we set up a new court just for this group of Muslim men. That's the first thing. The second is it was a huge mistake to set up a brand new court. It's always a huge mistake to set up a brand new court for a separate group of people, right? Because it's an untested forum. We don't know what the rules are. There's just one statute that's supposed to govern the whole thing, right? It's just a logistical nightmare. It's an administrative nightmare. And so part of the issue, aside from the torture, is just figuring out what law actually applies. You can't just, the Military Commissions Act, which is the statute that governs the commissions, doesn't say, look, if you if you are going to execute them, what is the mode of execution? Like that's it's actually an important question. Does constitutional law apply or not? Does Supreme Court precedent apply or not? All of these things that should apply to a death penalty case, are we taking as given or not? None of that is addressed, which is why you should never set up a separate court just for one group of people. It's illegal. And the third issue is within that, I think it has always been a huge mistake for the United States to try and charge 5 men together, initially 5, now 4 men together in this, what they wanted to have as the grand 9/11 case, right? And we know that the former chief prosecutor, Brigadier General Martins, wanted this to be like his own personal Nuremberg. Right. And that's why they were charged together. But, there's such a massive chasm of alleged culpability when you look at these 5 guys, right, that it doesn't make sense to try them all in one case. You've got Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, of course, who is the alleged mastermind of 9/11. And there's a lot of circumstantial evidence around all of these guys. You've got Ramzi bin al-Sheba, of course, who was allegedly involved in the Hamburg cell. You've got Khalid bin Atash, who was allegedly involved more with the USS Cole, but there's very little tying him to 9/11. And then you've got Ammar, my client, and Mustafa al-Hassawi, who are alleged to have participated in the financial transaction. And I'll tell you, we don't dispute the fact that financial transactions took place from Ammar's end, but again, tying Ammar's intent, right, with what he knew at the time, and he was never in Afghanistan, he was never a member of Al-Qaeda, he was never, none of that. He got, tying all of that together, it just doesn't make sense for all of these people to be in the same trial. And so I think that has hindered things as well, because the government is sort of hobbling along, trying to put together evidence against, this on this set of facts and on this set of facts. And then you come back full circle to the fact that most of the evidence they have, it was gathered by torture anyway. Right. So it's just a mess. It's a complete mess.
The way it sounds, it's just like it's more of a mess than I imagined. And yet you actually become involved. And this is your case now currently. You become involved with Ali Abdulaziz Ali, who's commonly known as Ammar al-Baluchi. And he just happens to be the nephew of the alleged 9/11 mastermind, the Bajinka plot mastermind, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Yeah. Baluchi was extensively tortured by the CIA after his arrest, and he's actually held at a black site north of Kabul in Afghanistan. How did you become involved with Baluchi?
Well, so first of all, I should say at this point that I can't confirm or deny any of the locations of the black sites.
Right.
But, and people talk about it publicly all the time. Just I can't confirm or deny exactly where he was held. I can tell you he was held at Site Cobalt, and that was the first site he was held at for about 6 months. And as you say, he was tortured just brutally, absolutely brutally.
Horrible stories I heard.
Yes. Yeah, just heinous. I mean, to the point where Mitchell and Jessen were both taken aback when I described what had happened to Ammar. And they said, no, like that. I mean, Mitchell said, sounds like your guy was used as a training prop. And Jessen said, no, that is not Mitchell. Jessen, who tends to be a little more measured than Dr. Mitchell, even he said, that is not at all how we would have applied those That's not how the techniques at all were supposed to be applied. It was heinous, and he suffered multiple traumatic brain injuries as a result of how he was tortured. He's got PTSD. He's only 46. He's turning 47 very soon. But he's got problems with his joints. He can't sleep. He's got sleep apnea because he was sleep deprived for 3.5 years, right? Just the worst possible. He lost an inordinate percentage of his body weight while at the black sites. So, I heard all through sort of the early aughts, you read the stories. I heard there were these secret prisons and there was this crazy stuff going on. And of course, you heard a lot more about Guantanamo because until about 2006, the black sites, there was nothing about the black sites or nothing confirmed about the black sites. And then the way it happened really was I was always involved in sort of war crimes, crimes against humanity, all of that. I was in private practice for a while, but maintained kind of a strong pro bono practice, helping the Open Society Justice Initiative with some of their initial cases at the European Court of Human Rights for Khalid al-Masri. And then I ended up joining the Constitution Project, which was a small organization here in Washington that was doing an in-depth investigation on, detention operations writ large post 9/11. And within that project, I became senior investigative counsel, and within that project, I did an investigation on the RDI program, the rendition, detention, interrogation. So after that project ended, that was a fixed term project. I was very lucky. I was asked by Reprieve, who I had gotten to know as an organization. They're a UK-based organization who've represented a very large dozens and dozens of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. I was asked by them to sort of help start the US office of Reprieve here in Washington. Because they wanted to do more litigation around Guantanamo, and they needed US qualified lawyers to do that. So I started representing guys on what we call the habeas side, trying to get them cleared for release, challenging conditions of confinement, and then negotiating their eventual releases. And we were successful with some of them. And then I got a call from a now friend, then sort of acquaintance at the military commissions, in 2015 saying, DOD has now allocated funds to hire civilians, because up until then, the military commissions were only hiring using military counsel and then sort of death penalty experts, because they're military commissions, right? You're supposed to have military lawyers. The problem with that is that, this mess that I was just telling you about, it's becoming clear that this is going to take a while, and military lawyers are deployed for a certain amount of time, and then they move on to the next thing. And so there was no institutional memory from, lawyer to lawyer, and they needed more long-term people. So they were starting to hire civilians. They'd heard a little bit in the press about some of the cases I'd done, and asked me to interview. And so that's how I became involved with Ammar's case.
So as you became more involved with Baluchi, investigators started piling up these massive amounts of charges that Baluchi was charged with. In fact, one interesting charge was that, according to U.S. investigators, Baluchi actually told them that Al Qaeda had set up a biological weapons lab, and he asked for Dr. Aifa Siddiqui, who you're very familiar with, advice on how long it would take to develop such weapons, and that Siddiqui replied that, quote unquote, and this is coming from U.S. investigators, that she was willing to participate in a biological weapons project if Al Qaeda tasked her to do so. And one of the operations involved Heathrow Airport. Were these known to you, by the way, by Baluchi or by the U.S. government? And were these or were these simply just confessions made from torture?
So I honestly can't speak too much to what, the case of Afia Siddiqui is actually beyond my scope. Like, I don't truly understand. All that is clear is that she's a very, very unwell person who is being kept in horrific conditions in prison in Texas. I understand that to be the case, but I'm just as flummoxed, I think, as the rest of the American public who know about her case as to what actually happened to her. It is very clear that she was tortured at some point, but I have no idea where she was, or there's a period of time when we don't know where she was possibly in U.S. custody, but the U.S. claims she was somewhere else. Like, it's honestly a mystery to me. Now, I know that, there are these allegations from U.S. investigators, and all I can say is I have never seen any evidence I can truly say I've never seen any evidence beyond these allegations that these statements were made.
Right. And look, this is a huge problem here, because there's so many, even with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, it was a CNN report where after he was tortured, there were 80 things that he pled guilty to. And when I looked at that, Alka, I said, all right, this wasn't just about information. This was a guy to make sure that he pled guilty to everything, even fictitious. I mean, 80 incidents, and he was just, I was flummoxed by it.
And look,
And
like obviously I don't represent Mr. Mohammed, but like I sit in a courtroom with Mr. Mohammed as well, and I can tell you, definitively he's a torture victim. He shows all the indicia of having been tortured. So, yeah, yes, a lot of people are like, well, he confessed to this, and
yeah,
that. There are all these statements that they've made that are defiant statements. And I would just say, look, like, number one, there's never been a trial. There has never been a trial. And if there is one, right, you're going to see, and you're seeing now in some of the suppression litigation we're doing in Guantanamo, the impact of this brutal torture on these men and the things they said as a result. So I think, it's a hard thing to do when we're talking about 9/11 because it is so inflammatory and so emotional for many people. But we really need to go back to square one and hold our judgment until the CIA and the government decide they want to be more open about exactly what they happened and where they got this evidence from.
this is the prominent point right here that you just made. I just want to use an example because I love using this example in terms of what torture can actually elicit. In the case of even Sheikh al-Libi, he's actually he's actually interrogated by the CIA, but it was Egypt that basically tortured him. This is before, I think, enhanced interrogation techniques. And what they wanted was a tie-in between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. And basically, Sheikh Ibn al-Libi was so brutally tortured that he told them that there was chemical and biological weapons training between the Ba'athist regime and Al-Qaeda. And actually, that information went to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, and he related that information. It was allegedly cleared by the CIA under DCI tenet. And Powell goes before the United Nations and tells everybody about this information. And then later on, he's told that al-Libi was visited after the war begins with Iraq, that investigators find out that al-Libi made up everything. Yeah. But what al-Libi basically said is the precursor to everything that you're experiencing right now. He basically told the investigators, I told you whatever you wanted for the torture to stop.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And you know what? There's a report that I talk about a lot because it's the one sort of real piece of evidence that we have. There's a report by the CIA Inspector General about Ammar, because he came to Guantanamo and he was like, I was tortured. Please, I was tortured. And so the Inspector General actually did an investigation. This is the CIA. It's not me talking. It's not Ammar talking. It's the CIA's internal watchdog did an investigation into Ammar's torture and pulls up all these statements from interrogators, these unnamed CIA interrogators who tortured him, like delineating how when he was tortured, he made all he's being so forthcoming now, and he's making all these statements. This is great. It's all actionable intelligence. And then like several weeks later, he says, none of that was true. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted it to stop. And these interrogators were like, well, now we have to warn him that he's going to be tortured again if he's not forthcoming. And I'm like, this is a crazy cycle. These are like supposed to be the elite intelligence officials of our country. And this is all in the CIA's report. This is all in the CIA's Inspector General's report. That's not coming from me or Ammar. That's not defense, biased information. That's the CIA.
And just to top on that a little bit, just to ask you, Alka, you personally, you weren't the only one, but you personally had to go through an enormous amount of interference involving with the alBaluchi case when you wanted actually some assistance from the state and the CIA. You were actually met with adamant refusal to even cooperate by the CIA, and it seems that I'm assuming that this was even expected on your behalf. Or maybe not. Can you explain?
Not to this extent. Never to this extent. So we knew going into it. So I have a top secret security clearance. Everyone involved in the case has a top secret security clearance. I have the same security clearance as the prosecution. But the Military Commissions Act, that one statute that governs everything, allows the prosecution unfettered access to the intelligence community to be able to get documents from them and then decide what's relevant to give to defense. And that is, coming back to what's taking so long, that is really what has what has forced the longevity of these proceedings, because they'll give us a little piece of something and we'll say, okay, where's the rest of it? There's clearly information missing. Where's this, and this? Then they'll go back and it'll take another year to get like a little bit more, right? That's the process we've been going through. So we knew that would be the process. We had no idea the scope of how much they meaning first the agents, the agencies, the intelligence agencies, and the prosecution were withholding, right? So I'll give you an example. We had said since 2012, which is the second incarnation of the Military Commission, started in 2012. The first incarnation in 2008 was found to be unconstitutional, got rid of it, started a new one in 2012. From 2012 onwards, we said, look, the bulk of the evidence you want to use are these statements that were made by our clients in 2007 at Guantanamo Bay after they were brought from the black sites, right? These sort of what the government calls clean team statements made to the FBI. We would like all information. This is relevant. It's a death penalty case. We're entitled to anything we think is relevant to the defense. We would like all information about the relationship between the FBI and the CIA at the black sites. Right? We want to know how much these clean team FBI agents knew about what happened to these guys and what they said at the black sites, right? Because there's no way they didn't know anything. There's no way, right? We said that, and the government for years and years and years, 6 years to be precise, said there is no information. You are fishing for information that doesn't exist. You're wasting time. This is all a big ploy by the defense to delay justice for the country and everyone else, right? 2017, one of those FBI agents testifies on an unrelated issue. And she's asked by one of the counsel, just off the cuff, so what information did you have before you interviewed them in 2007? She's like, oh yeah, we had access to their black site statements. Right? And there's an audible gasp in the courtroom. We're all sitting there, we're just like, what? This is what we've been asking for 5.5 years at this point. Then it takes another few months and the prosecution immediately knows they're in trouble, right? May 2018, we finally get, like, the dam breaks and we get an acknowledgement from the prosecution that, look, we didn't know this existed, but the FBI and the CIA actually had a memorandum of understanding beginning in 2003 that the FBI would be able to send questions to the black sites, would even be able to detail people to the black sites. They would become CIA agents at the black sites, okay? And the same people who wrote those questions and got the answers back and worked it into the Pentagon investigation, worked it into the 9/11 Commission report, were the same people who then went to Guantanamo Bay knowing what Ammar had said for 3 years, knowing because it was their questions, and then question him. Those were the so-called clean teams, okay? And we didn't find any of this out until 6 years into this. And we are still today getting information about that connection.
And yet the FBI actually denied having any connections with the torture program itself.
Yes. And I'm sorry, but Robert Mueller, who everyone likes to hold up as a paragon, got up and I will not accuse him of perjuring himself, but he gave information that was very clearly meant to indicate before the Judiciary Committee, meant to indicate that the FBI had no role whatsoever in the CIA torture program, and that was false.
Now, recently, you argued that the judge, currently Colonel Matthew McCall, I think he's the 5th judge or the 6th judge involved in the
Depends
case.
on how you count.
I'd say I'm losing. I mean, some of these people are old, they got old and retired. You actually argued that they should be compelled the testimony of this covert officer from the CIA black sites. Now, he's only known as SG-1, but he had substantial contact with Ammar al-Baluchi, and I believe it was 11 times at CIA black sites. Can you elaborate more on this and what you wanted from McCall?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so one of the things, when you asked, did you imagine that there'd be this level of interference? The other thing I was going to say about this, and this sort of sets up the answer to your question, is the other thing I was not expecting was the prohibition on defense investigation of
Yes.
the case. I mean, it's a death penalty case. It's unheard of. And the fact that since 2018, we have been prevented from speaking to CIA officials involved in the black sites, some of whom put in their LinkedIn profiles, right? That they were like at this site or another site or whatever, like, and the prosecution's getting up and saying the defense cannot be trusted. They're going to reach out and they're going to, out these people. That's not at all what we want to do, by the way.
Right.
Like, we're very, very conscientious, clearance holders. But we should be able to speak to them, even in a secure location, and interview them, find out what they knew about, what they see, some of them have made written statements about the fact that they didn't agree with the torture, that they didn't agree with the way they were being interrogated. I'd like to know more about that. So we did not anticipate that level of interference. And so as we've continued to litigate these the suppression of the statements that these guys made in 2007, now that we know that they were not in fact cleansed at all, we have asked repeatedly for some of these CIA personnel to come and testify. And the government has repeatedly said, no, you're getting Mitchell and Jessen, and that's it. And for us, right, that Mitchell and Jessen are directly relevant to Mr. Mohammed. They waterboarded him. They participated in his torture. They are not really directly relevant to Ammar's torture or the use of techniques on him. They were not there for that. And so we want the people who were there for that, who authorized it, who saw Ammar directly after that. SG-1 is one of those individuals who had knowledge of Mr. al-Baluchi's early torture. And so SG-1 is one of the code names that Judge McCall has heard many times, and Judge McCall has shown some interest in at least examining the question of whether he needs to hear from these people in order to form a more complete picture of what happened at the black sites. And so he actually asked us to put arguments in front of him about why that would be relevant. And I was very happy to do so, because I do think it's directly relevant. I do think that, look, I'll be very honest, I don't think you need much more information than what we've already put in front of the American public to determine that this was torture and these guys can't be prosecuted with this evidence. But for a full picture, you do need the CIA personnel. We can put in place whatever protections they need. This is the CIA we're talking about. We can protect their identities. But we need to hear their testimony, what they have to say about what they saw, not just what Mitchell and Jessen saw in their very limited capacity.
And yet this same officer, SG-1, is also involved with Walid bin Attash, also known as Khalid, who was alleged to be behind the USS Cole, including having contact with him 79 times between May and June of 2003. But I read from one of the prosecutors, and it was Army Major Neville Destor, who wished for SG-1 not to be questioned by the defense, but you argued that the government and CIA has been on notice for at least 5 years that covert witnesses might be needed in court.
Yeah.
And can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Of course. So, we initially filed our motions to suppress this evidence in May 2019. In May 2019, we were asked to file two things: the motions to suppress, why we think the evidence should be thrown out, and witness lists to go along with that motion to suppress, who we think would support the motion to suppress. Our witness list on behalf of Mr. al-Baluchi was about 120 people, okay? And that included, 120 people. That included about 50 CIA officials who were at the black sites, people who were there were about a dozen who were directly involved just in Ammar's torture, early torture at Cobalt. There are another couple dozen who spent the next 3 years interrogating him repeatedly, like multiple times a day, and recording both his answers on the substantive questions they were asking and his conditions of confinement and what his moods were and what his mental state was, right, at the time that he was answering these questions. So those are super important people. Then there's another about a dozen people, give or take a few, who were at the top of the food chain at the CIA, who were making these decisions to, for example, render Ammar to Cobalt, even though he was described as being very forthcoming upon arrest in Pakistan, very cooperative.
Right.
And even then, there's this thing in the OIG report, in the CIA's report, saying it's not really clear why the decision was made from the get-go, as soon as they knew of his arrest, to render him, even though he was being compliant. So I'd like those people to come and talk about that. So there were all these CIA people. Then you have you have a number of experts that we wanted to come and talk about, both psychological experts, torture experts, prison experts, right? And we have been able to have a few of them come. We had people who were involved with the development of the RDI program, everyone from John Yoo, Will Taft, Alberto Gonzalez, Jose Rodriguez, right, who has spoken at length publicly about the program. To again, people who are more covert, who have code names. So it's 120 people on that list. The government initially said, well, we'll give you 10, including Mitchell and Jessen. And that has increased over the years. But so this all happened in 2019. SG1 was on that list in 2019. So they have known since 2019 that this was a possibility. Regardless of their position has always been, we're only going to give you Mitchell and Jessen. But they've known since 2019 that we have requested these people, and that it was a possibility that those people would be compelled by the military judge to come. So the fact that 5 years later, we're standing in a courtroom arguing, and Major Dastoor is arguing, this is dangerous for these people and we don't have a way to protect their identities, is ludicrous to me, because again, this is the CIA we are talking about. And I think, as I said in oral argument, it's not the best advert for the CIA, is it? If they can't figure out how to get their people, with covert identities intact into a secure building in the National Capital Region.
Yeah, and just to add, Jose Rodriguez actually was responsible for the destruction of Abu Zubaydah's torture tapes, I believe.
He was one of the people who approved the destruction of the tapes. Another person who, of course, was involved in that was Gina Haspel,
Gina, that's right,
director of the CIA. But yes, Jose was, I think, at the top of that authority at the time, and made the decision.
Richard, do you have any follow-up questions?
I really don't. But actually, what I will do is I'll read the thing that I often read in these interviews, which is a quote from Mark Twain regarding the use of torture in the war in the Philippines 100 years ago, where he says, "To make them confess to what? Truth or lies? How can one know which it is they are telling? For under endurable pain, a man confesses anything that is required of him, true or false, and his evidence is worthless." And it's just a comment, really, that I think that's struck me throughout this, that how can the CIA, this organization that goes in and overthrows governments around the world, and basically had this completely disproportionate influence on the latter half of the 20th century, starting in Iran and Guatemala and onwards, and they don't seem to understand what's obvious to Mark Twain 100 years ago when this was being done in the Philippines. And it's just, I think that I was coloured in a lot of detail on that in terms of how people get into a mindset where they convince themselves that they're doing something. It's not torture, and that's why it'll be effective, because obviously torture isn't effective, but what we're doing is not torture. So therefore, but yeah, that's been a constant theme to me of thinking, well, were they trying to get them to say things that weren't true? Were they trying to get Abu Zubaydah to say Iraq was involved instead of Saudi Arabia, or what? This kind of thing. I suppose there's a grey line there between they may have been, but were they even aware that they were trying to get lies out of people? Or was it just they believed the lies? So that's my comment, really, which, Alka, you're welcome to say anything about.
Yeah, I think, as I just said, right, there are dozens and dozens of CIA personnel we'd like to hear from. And the quote actually goes to that. What you just said goes to why we requested all of them, because there is from what we can see in some of the statements that have been made by these different CIA personnel, all with code names, is that there's a real variety of motivations there, right? You can see that some of them were, so maybe like Mitchell and Jessen, think they're doing the right thing and they don't want to do it necessarily, but they're going to do it because this is the patriotic thing to do. And they're being told it's legal, of course, so they think that's a blank check. Then there are those people who say, they attacked my homeland, I'm going to get them, right? And there's a very strong thread of that among certain of these CIA personnel who are, described as like, some of the females like stripping in the black sites just to make the guys uncomfortable, and smacking them and telling them to, call them sir, and things that have nothing to do with interrogation, have nothing to do with the science of report building or anything, the actual scientific techniques, right, that you use to get usable information. It's just revenge, right? It's just a revenge fantasy. And so, and you also see some of them commenting contemporaneously, I don't think this is working. I think we're relying too much on these techniques. I don't know if we're getting good information. I have a lot of doubts about that. And you do have a handful of people who actually leave the program because they can't justify what they're seeing and what is coming out of it. So that's why we asked for such a breadth of witnesses.
Alka, my last question for you is a bit conspiratorial, so forgive me. And but there was something that I'd like to get your thoughts on, because you'll have a very different perspective. And I spoke with FBI officials like Mark Rossini and Ken Williams and others on the show, and I'm a little bit taken aback by the fact that the intelligence community, especially the CIA and notoriously the NSA, I believe, had enough information as to where, if they were shared with the State Department and the FBI, could have prevented 9/11. Well, the only thing we're missing is obviously specifics to who, what, when, where, and why. And that's currently why we're in this trial. Mm-hmm. But I'm also led to believe by a statement made to me by Ken Williams, who wrote the Phoenix memo, is an FBI agent based out of Phoenix. And I asked him one question. I said, Ken, do you really think the trial will happen? And he said, no. He said, I'm sometimes at Guantanamo. He says, no, they're going to make a deal. And I said, really? He goes, yeah, they're probably going to take the death penalty off the table. And the lawyers for these individuals are basically going to be really wrought with weariness and grief and just say, you know what, this is the best deal we're going to get. The hell with the trial. It's never going to really start. And they're just going to be basically either in Guantanamo or shipped off to either Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or some other prison to live out the rest of their lives. And here's my conspiratorial point. If you can't answer it, don't bother. It's something that really bothers me. My fear is this. We will if that happens, we'll never know in this period right now what the government had for evidence, what they don't have.
Yeah.
And that bothers me.
Yeah.
Is that the same for you?
Absolutely, it does. It bothers everyone involved in this, I think, and it should. The fact that there is so much information missing, from the public record. I think it's now no secret that certainly the FBI and CIA were not communicating. There were a ton of intelligence failures, and 9/11 could have been prevented, I believe, based on that. There is, they've picked these 5 guys to prosecute, but 9/11 was a massive conspiracy, right? There are a lot of pieces missing from the courtroom. They just picked the guys they had, and I say that without opining on anyone else other than my client. But, as I've said before, the putting together of these 5 people doesn't make a lot of sense unless that's what you've got. And you want to kind of make a show of it. So look, I will also tell you, and this is a matter of public record, I've said this before, that for a lot of defense counsel, I think we do think that one of the best ways to handle this would be to resolve the cases, because there's no way to have a fair trial anymore, for any of this. They're not going to bring them to the United States. And even if they did, none of this evidence would be admissible anyway. Right. There's no way to have a fair trial. These guys are deteriorating fast. In fact, it's really alarming how quickly they're starting to deteriorate now, these past couple of years in mental and physical health. One of them, of course, Ramzi bin al-Sheba, was severed from the case last year because of his mental illness, which was directly caused by his torture. And so it's difficult to say, but I don't know if there will be a trial. I don't believe, for posterity, I don't believe there will ever be a fair 9/11 trial, that's for sure. If there were a way to resolve the cases while somehow maintaining an obligation of transparency, not just for the guys, but for the government, for all this information that the government still refuses to give us, like clear defense counsel, right? Much less the public. That would be, I think in the interest of justice. But, I don't get much of a say in any of this except to complain.
Last word, Alka. What are you working on? And what would you like the public to know currently about why this is important to know for you and for the public as well?
So right now, my focus, sort of laser focus, is on the suppression litigation, is on making sure that not just that we make the best case, but I do think it is both important that we make the best case possible in front of the judge, that these statements are the product of torture and cannot be used, but also that we make the best case for the public as much as we can within the confines of classification, because the public deserves to know why there has not been a trial for 9/11 yet, right? This is a matter of national interest. They deserve to know that it is the government writ large, for successive administrations, that have maintained this level of secrecy and broken laws year after year after year after year, that have now ruled out any possibility of a fair trial for 9/11. So that's what where our focus is, within the boundaries of our clearances, making sure that the public knows what we're doing, to the extent that there is interest. And the other thing is just that, Ammar is a human being, and I'm not asking anyone to have a particular opinion about any of the defendants or Ammar, but it should be understood, right, that these people are not mutants. They're not robots. They are human beings who respond in a human way to the same pressures, the same incentives, the same things that any of us do. And so when we're talking about torture, right, it is not that somebody who may or may not have been involved in 9/11 is uniquely resistant to torture. That is not the case. And if you read any of the very public information about Ammar and his response to torture, you'll understand just how absolutely excruciating and damaging it was for him.
Alka Pradhan, lawyer for 9/11 defendant Ammar al-Baluchi, human rights attorney, and all-around genuine human being. Thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. And again, thank you so much for the invitation. Such a pleasure.
Thank you.